The heaviest silence in the world doesn't belong to a graveyard. It belongs to a home where the people inside are drifting like ghosts, unsure if they are still someone to come home to. My name is Rachel. I am 43, and most days I exist almost invisibly within walls that hold far more quiet than actual sound. Some mornings, like today, I don't even wake to an alarm. The light filtering through the curtains simply feels different, softer and somewhat hesitant, as if it is holding its breath, waiting for me to finally notice it. The sunlight hit at just the right angle as I stood in the kitchen peeling the last potato from the basket. It was completely dry and misshapen, but I worked at it steady and slow, determined not to waste a single scrap. As the sun slipped through the window and cut across the table to rest on my hands, I noticed the wrinkles were deeper this year, the skin visibly loosening around my knuckles. Outside, the trees swayed just a fraction, and the faint clatter of a radio 2 houses down drifted in, playing that same old Sunday tune. It had become just another layer of background noise, no different than the low hum of the refrigerator or the familiar creak of the floorboard beneath the sink. Everything felt entirely predictable. Elias's photograph still sat in its exact designated spot on the fridge, held up by a chipped magnet. He was only 6 years old in that picture, his cheeks full and his eyes wide as he stood out in the garden gripping a juice box in one hand and a stick in the other. I used to tell him he looked like he was gearing up to conquer the backyard, and he had flashed that toothy, unbothered grin that children only show when they genuinely believe you. But he wasn't 6 anymore. He was nearly grown, turning exactly 18 today. I dumped the potato peels into the sink and let the water run, leaving it rushing for far too long simply because I needed to hear the sound of it. My hands gripped the edge of the counter while the stream splashed and softly echoed against the steel. Over in the dining room, a card remained standing on the mantel. He had given it to me last year, bearing no signature, just the words, "You are home." I had kept it all this time, even though I was no longer sure if the sentiment still held true. Soon, I caught the sound of footsteps upstairs. The old floorboards allowed me to count every single one as Elias got out of bed. He always moved with a careful hesitation, almost as if he wasn't entirely sure the floor would successfully hold his weight. I dried my hands, folded the towel in half, folded it once more, and set it down on the counter. Minutes later he appeared, his hair still messy, and his shoulders sitting taller than I remembered. He bypassed conversation entirely, walking straight to the fridge to pull out the juice. I found myself watching him without intending to, noting how his arms had grown leaner and stronger, and how his back curved in that familiar way when he leaned against the counter. "Morning," I offered gently. He gave a slight nod. "Hey." I managed a small smile at that. It used to be Mom or Ma, but now it was just hey. Still, it was a sound, a connection. We settled into a quiet that wasn't exactly uncomfortable, yet it lacked any real warmth. It felt like lingering in a hallway suspended between rooms. He took a sip of his drink while I uselessly stirred a pot that required no stirring at all. "I don't want a cake," he announced after the silence stretched. I looked over at him. "I didn't make one." "Good." I nodded in return, unable to untangle whether I felt relieved, devastated, or a complex mixture of both. Birthdays in this house used to mean a living room full of balloons and streamers, with cousins packed tightly into the backyard. Today, the reality was just the two of us, and the heavy, earthy smell of boiled potatoes. "I might go out later," he muttered, turning his face toward the window, so his expression remained calm and unreadable. "Not sure." "Okay," I replied. That was the entirety of the exchange. No pressing about who he was seeing, no questions about what time he'd return, just okay. As his hands absent-mindedly traced the condensation beading on his glass, I felt a desperate urge to ask him something, anything at all, but I couldn't. The words sat like lead in my throat, threatening to clatter loudly to the floor if I dared to speak them. Instead, I leaned back against the stove, watching the steam curl slowly upward into the air. The silence wedged between us wasn't actively hostile. It was simply vast and wide, like an ocean trapped at low tide. Suddenly, his eyes shifted to me, lingering a fraction longer than usual, as if he were internally weighing a heavy decision. "Tonight," Elias said, his voice dropping quietly, "I'll cook." By evening, the kitchen was thick with the scent of stubborn, earthy rosemary and burnt toast. It wasn't the aggressive kind of burnt that triggers the smoke alarm, but just enough of a char to make a person wonder if a crucial detail had been entirely forgotten. I hovered nervously near the doorway, terrified that stepping fully into the room would violently disrupt whatever delicate rhythm Elias had managed to establish. He stood with his back facing me, one hand confidently steadying a pan while the other seamlessly flicked the stove dial to the off position. There was no background music playing, just the soft, methodical clatter of utensils and the distinct scrape of metal brushing against ceramic. A pot lid shifted slightly as steam escaped, and I caught the sound of him exhaling quietly, revealing that this act of cooking required not just his full attention, but an immense amount of emotional restraint. He was still dressed in his gray hoodie, the sleeves casually rolled up to his elbows, and his hair remained visibly damp, looking as though he had only bothered to half dry it after stepping out of the shower. I remained observing from the threshold far longer than I had intended. The morning's bright light had long since softened, now slanting through the blinds to spill across the countertop in fractured, broken stripes. The kitchen table had been meticulously cleared, leaving only a single plate resting dead in the center, accompanied by a folded napkin and a fork placed with absolute precision beside it. My chest suddenly tightened, not with maternal pride, but with the jarring unfamiliarity of the scene. He had never done something like this before. I cleared my throat lightly, intending it as a gentle gesture to announce my presence, rather than an actual demand to speak. He didn't turn around. "Eggs are still warm," he stated flatly. "I made too much." "You always make too much," I replied, forcing an attempt at a smile. He simply shrugged. "Habit, I guess." I finally stepped fully inside the room, feeling as though the thick scent of rosemary had physically soaked directly into the walls. He offered a brief motion toward the solitary plate. "If you are hungry." I nodded in agreement. Even though my appetite was non-existent, the sheer magnitude of the gesture felt significantly bigger than any physical hunger. "Thanks," I said softly. He proceeded to pour 2 glasses of water, intentionally placing one directly across from me at the table. Still, he avoided all eye contact, relying strictly on small, incredibly careful movements. We both sat down. As I picked up the neatly placed fork, I noticed a slight tremor in my hand, perhaps a reaction to the heat of the food, or perhaps something much deeper. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" I asked, attempting to bridge the gap. He delivered another casual shrug. "YouTube late nights. You don't sleep much." "Not really." We consumed the meal in absolute silence. It was not the toxic silence born of avoidance, but rather the highly fragile silence of 2 people desperately unwilling to risk ruining a fleeting moment by naming it prematurely. My eyes drifted around the kitchen, taking in the familiarly cluttered corner, situated right by the fridge, the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, and the neglected pile of unread mail abandoned on the windowsill. Aesthetically, everything looked exactly the same, yet fundamentally, the entire atmosphere felt slightly shifted, as if the room itself had tilted on its axis. "You didn't have to do all this," I noted quietly. I know, still, it is nice. He nodded, keeping his eyes firmly anchored to his plate. I caught the subtle movement of his fingers lightly tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Against the harsh edge of the table, happening just once before going completely still. There was something highly specific about the way he sat, his body angled slightly away from me, that instantly pulled me back to when he was a little boy. He used to sit at this exact same table to draw his pictures, keeping his head ducked down and his shoulders hunched defensively, visibly afraid I might look at his work too closely. Back then, I always pretended I wasn't peeking until he voluntarily offered the paper up himself. Now, sitting across from this grown version of my son, I couldn't help but deeply wonder what intricate scenes he might be drawing inside his head, securely locked behind those unreadable eyes. I took another bite. The toast tasted a bit bitter, but I honestly didn't mind. When I was entirely finished, I set the fork down and took the time to fold the napkin neatly in half. Elias stood up with agonizing slowness and proceeded to rinse his empty glass out in the sink. The tap water ran softly for a moment, then abruptly stopped. He made no move to ask me for help, nor did he ask me to leave the room. He didn't even ask me to sit down. But I chose to sit anyway. Later, the door to his bedroom was left cracked open just wide enough to feel like a genuine, albeit hesitant, invitation. It wasn't swung wide, nor did it feel overly deliberate, but it was just enough to clearly signal that he hadn't chosen to close himself off from the world completely. I stood paralyzed out in the hallway, gripping a mug of completely lukewarm tea in my hand, overcome with hesitation. The carpet beneath my feet possessed a faint, silent give, yet I felt as though every single step I took was intensely noticed. Taking a breath, I tapped gently once on the solid wooden door frame. "Mind if I come in?" A distinct, rustling sound followed, perhaps the shifting of paper or fabric, before Elias's voice rang out, low but incredibly clear. "Yeah, it is fine." I carefully nudged the door open using my elbow and stepped into his space. The very air inside his bedroom carried a fundamentally different texture. It wasn't stale or stuffy, but rather thick and heavy with an emotional weight I couldn't quite put a name to. It felt like stepping directly into memory, encountering a complex version of my son I had never formally been introduced to. He was positioned cross-legged on the floor, totally surrounded by a chaotic sea of notebooks, scattered photos, and what appeared to be meticulously hand-drawn storyboards. A solitary lamp tucked in the corner cast a soft, forgiving light over the scene, while a half-drunk glass of juice rested near his foot. He refused to look up immediately, opting instead to keep flipping through pages as if my presence hadn't registered. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing his established rhythm, I sank slowly onto the extreme edge of the bed. I set my tea down on the nightstand, resulting in a faint, sharp clink. "What are you working on?" I inquired. He shrugged casually. "Just ideas, sketches, stuff for class. Or maybe not. I don't know. Can I see?" He paused abruptly. His fingers hovered uncertainly over a specific page for a long moment before he finally turned it outward toward me. It revealed a rough, highly emotive charcoal sketch depicting two solitary people sitting together on a bench. One figure was depicted leaning aggressively forward, while the other was shown leaning passively back. The stark, empty space rendered between them felt significantly more telling than the actual figures themselves. "It is beautiful," I breathed sincerely. He shot me a quick, assessing glance, clearly unsure if my compliment was genuine. It absolutely was. "I draw when things don't make sense," he confessed softly. "It helps put them somewhere." I nodded in understanding, taking a slow sip of my intensely bitter tea. "Do things not make sense right now?" He let out a heavy breath that fell just short of qualifying as a full sigh. "Sometimes I think I forget how to talk about things." but drawing, it doesn't need permission. A sudden, profound fragility manifested in the room. It wasn't a weak or shattered kind of fragile, but rather the delicate anticipation of a completely unopened letter. "Can I sit here for a while?" I asked. He offered no verbal answer, but crucially, he didn't utter a no. He simply resumed his drawing, and I simply allowed myself to watch him. Sitting there, I began to vividly notice all the small, intricate details, the specific, rhythmic way he tapped the wooden pencil against his knee, while deep in thought, the dark smudge of charcoal marring his wrist, and the delicate shadow his eyelashes cast upon his cheek whenever he looked down. These were the intimate details I used to know intimately, without even having to consciously notice them. Slowly, the stifling silence organically grew into something genuinely comfortable. I made no attempt to forcefully fill it, and neither did he. Eventually, he shifted his weight slightly and extended another sketchbook in my direction. "This one's older," he offered. I flipped the cover open, fully expecting to be met with more sketches of isolated benches or sweeping landscapes. Instead, I was confronted with page after page of strictly drawn eyes. There were dozens of them, some firmly closed, others half-lidded, and some wide open, all meticulously captured, conveying vastly different moods, and rendered with contrasting textures. "These are all mine?" I gasped, the question escaping my lips before I could properly stop myself. He provided a single affirming nod. "I used to draw you when you weren't looking." The sheer gravity of his words landed with a quiet, undeniable weight, rendered totally speechless. I reached out and gently traced the contours of one specific drawing with the very tip of my finger. The likeness wasn't entirely photographically accurate, but it radiated an undeniable honesty. By then, my cup of tea had cooled completely. He continued sketching, and I remained seated without moving a muscle. For the absolute first time in what felt like an eternity, I had absolutely no desire to leave the room. However, the very next morning the fragile bridge collapsed. His door was firmly closed, securely locked, and radiating silence. There was no welcoming crack of light shining through, and no low, rhythmic hum of music leaking out from underneath the frame. There was only an absolute, crushing stillness. The sudden shift startled me far more deeply than I had anticipated. After experiencing the quiet, tentative openness of the previous night, this aggressive silence felt remarkably colder and shockingly final. I stood frozen out in the hallway for a prolonged period, my fresh tea entirely forgotten in my hand, totally unsure of what to do with this massive, newly erected pause separating us. There was something about the specific way the morning light struck that firmly shut door that made the barrier feel far more permanent than it reasonably should have, resembling a harsh, unforgiving verdict. I intentionally chose not to knock right away. I actively tried to convince myself that he might still simply be asleep, perhaps lost deep in thought, or just requiring a bit of personal space. But as the hours slowly ticked past, I checked the hallway again, only to be met with the exact same unbroken silence. By noon, I succumbed and left a physical note right outside his door. I kept it deliberately devoid of drama, presenting just a folded piece of paper bearing my visibly uneven handwriting, warped by hesitation, "I am around if you need anything." He never responded to it. Later that day, while lingering in the kitchen, I discovered his cup from the previous day still abandoned in the sink. A faint, undeniable pink ring originating from the juice remained permanently stained at the very bottom of the glass. I couldn't bring myself to wash it. The act somehow felt entirely too personal. I proceeded to wander aimlessly throughout the house, plagued by a strange, gnawing restlessness that only manifests when you desperately miss someone who is still physically located nearby. Every single room seemed to powerfully echo the hollow absence of something precious that had barely even begun to bloom. The hallway, A space where we used to routinely pass each other without uttering a single word, now felt dangerously charged and incredibly heavy. Around 3 o'clock, I purposely walked past his door once more. It remained resolutely shut. When night finally fell, I intentionally left the hallway light illuminated. A resurrected old habit stemming from years ago, back when he used to be terrified of roaring storms or the dark shadows lurking under his bed. I fully recognized the action was arguably silly, and perhaps even slightly intrusive at his current age, but something about that soft, familiar glow made it marginally easier for me to attempt sleep. Except, I never actually slept. I spent the night staring blankly up at the ceiling, straining to listen for any sign of movement, for the thud of footsteps, for the scrape of a drawer opening, for absolutely anything at all. Nothing ever came. The following morning I discovered that the handwritten note I had left was missing, yet the door itself stayed stubbornly closed. A part of me reasoned that the removal of the note should have been enough, functioning as a small, quiet acknowledgement. Yet, I fundamentally couldn't decipher the meaning behind the action. Was it a silent expression of thanks, or was it a definitive goodbye? Following that, I intentionally stopped passing by his room altogether. Instead, I isolated myself in the kitchen, obsessively rearranging random drawers that required absolutely no organizing. I even initiated a new routine of drinking my tea out on the back porch, braving the blowing wind solely because it provided a tangible excuse to stop hovering in the house. One evening the silence broke when I finally heard him actively moving around again. They were only faint, muted noises, the harsh scrape of a chair moving, and a quiet, muffled cough. But they were undeniable. I felt a powerful, overwhelming urge to rush directly in and say something, anything at all to break the tension, but my feet remained stubbornly rooted in place. It was in that paralyzing moment I realized a harsh truth. The deep stillness existing between us was not a newly formed phenomenon. It had realistically always been there, just existing in a far quieter state. It had been heavily camouflaged by daily routines, by years spent mindlessly brushing past one another, and by the dangerous illusion that simply residing under the same roof equated to genuine closeness. I honestly didn't know if the current distance was a result of him actively retreating, or if it was simply a consequence of me expecting entirely too much from him. Eventually, I tracked him down and found him out in the garage, completely idle. He was merely sitting on the battered old tool bench, intensely staring down at his own empty hands. His shoulders were tightly hunched forward, driven not by the physical cold, but by the specific kind of crushing heaviness that firmly takes up residence deep within the chest. Thick dust hung suspended in the striking sunbeams, resembling quiet, floating memories. The dusty radio sitting up on the shelf was switched off. In fact, absolutely everything in the room was off. He didn't bother to look up when I finally stepped into the space. He just maintained his action of aggressively rubbing his bare palms together, almost as if he were desperately trying to make some kind of logical sense out of them. I consciously chose not to speak right away. In this fragile new dynamic, there simply didn't seem to be a definitively right way to act anymore. There was only the act of maintaining presence. So I slowly lowered myself onto the small, wobbly stool positioned near the door, ensuring I didn't sit too close. "I used to come here when I was younger," he suddenly stated, his voice incredibly low, practically speaking directly to the surrounding walls. "Dad taught me how to use that saw." He explicitly pointed over to the dark corner of the room. I hated it too loud. I allowed a barely perceptible smile to touch my lips. "Your father always needed something to fix." He offered no response to that, keeping his intense gaze locked firmly on his hands. I deeply wondered what exactly he was seeing reflected in them. Whether it was overwhelming guilt, the sheer vastness of our distance, or the cruel passage of time. After a prolonged stretch of silence, he asked the dreaded question, "Why'd you stop coming in here?" I blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I didn't think it was mine anymore." That specific admission finally caused him to glance up at me, just for a single fleeting second. However, it powerfully felt as though an entire exhausting conversation had successfully passed between us within the span of that one brief look. "You didn't come to my graduation?" he whispered softly, his voice utterly devoid of any sharp edge or malice. It contained nothing but raw, devastating truth. My breath violently caught in my throat. "I didn't know if I was invited. You were." We sat paralyzed within that deeply shared ache, functioning as two distinctly separate people, forcefully holding on to wildly different pieces of the exact same tragic misunderstanding. "I wanted to go," I fiercely insisted, my voice thick. I didn't want to be where I wasn't wanted." He nodded slowly, absorbing the confession. "I thought you didn't care." I looked at him then. I truly, deeply looked at him. There was absolutely no trace of blame left residing in his eyes, only the exact same hollow, consuming loneliness that I had personally felt all these years. It was the mutual, desperate longing to be genuinely seen, and not just merely remembered as a fixture in a house. "I cared more than I ever knew how to show," I whispered back, the absolute truth finally breaking free. He immediately looked away, his jaw clenching visibly tight with emotion. Seizing the tiny sliver of connection, I slowly stood up from the stool and confidently crossed the dusty floor to the main bench. I sat down right beside him, positioning myself close enough to physically feel the radiating heat rolling off his shoulder, but carefully maintaining enough distance to ensure he wouldn't feel compelled to move away. "I made tea," I announced quietly after a full minute had passed. "That cinnamon one you used to hate. I still make it out of habit." He surprisingly let out the absolute softest, most fragile laugh. "It wasn't the tea, it was how sweet you made it. I'll ruin it less next time." He didn't vocalize any strict promise that there would definitively be a next time, but crucially, he didn't stand up to leave either. We remained seated together on that bench until the surrounding shadows stretched out and grew noticeably longer, and the garage air finally cooled down around us. And within the profound silence that followed that deeply exposing conversation, something resting squarely between us felt tangibly lighter, even though practically nothing had been formally resolved. The morning after that revelation, the kitchen air smelled strongly of fresh toast and severely oversteeped tea. I stood completely barefoot on the freezing cool tile, silently watching the metal kettle intensely hiss on the stove. The window was propped cracked open, actively letting in the crisp, early morning light, and for one fleeting, beautiful moment, absolutely everything felt distinctly ordinary. Things weren't magically fixed, they were simply quieter. He hadn't made his way down the stairs yet, and I honestly wasn't entirely sure if he even would. The events of last night had definitively settled something profound between us, or perhaps it had merely forcefully stirred it all up again. It was the specific kind of emotional stirring that never actually leads to clear, concise answers, but instead only manifests as a much softer, more manageable kind of ache. I methodically prepared the tea. I deliberately chose the cinnamon kind, making sure it wasn't overly sweet this time around. Over on the counter, the radio suddenly flickered to life, buzzing with a wave of harsh static before finally locking onto a clear station. It began broadcasting some old, sleepy jazz track that sounded just a little bit out of tune. I allowed the music to continue playing undisturbed. His personal mug sat waiting directly on the table. It was the specific one possessing a noticeably chipped rim that he had persistently refused to ever replace. I carefully filled his mug to the brim, subsequently filled my own, and then sat down to wait. The toast aggressively popped up from the toaster. I made absolutely no move to reach for it. When he finally entered the kitchen, his hair was, as usual, still notably damp. He didn't bother to offer a verbal good morning. He just shot me a highly uncertain look, appearing as though he genuinely didn't know what the proper protocol was for what to do next. I silently offered the steaming mug toward him, and he accepted it. We began to drink in complete silence. I dreamed about the lake, he unexpectedly revealed, his intense stare firmly locked onto the open window. That summer when the boat flipped and we both pretended it didn't scare us. I found myself smiling at the vivid recollection. You were shivering. You made a fire with wet branches. Everything smelled like smoke for days. We didn't erupt into laughter over the memory, but there was an undeniable warmth deeply held within the shared recollection. I am thinking of moving out, he eventually stated, speaking only after a remarkably long pause. Not far, just space. I firmly nodded my head in agreement. That is good, I'll still come by, for tea. He sharply glanced at me then, his eyes perfectly clear, projecting a look as though he were silently asking if that kind of ongoing connection would truly be allowed. You don't need an excuse, I reassured him firmly. You never did. He slowly leaned back in his chair, folding his arms protectively across his chest. In the background, the sleepy jazz playing on the radio seamlessly faded into yet another gentle melody. I don't know what we are anymore, he murmured softly. You and me. Neither do I confessed honestly, but maybe that is okay. The bright morning light gently touched the side of his face, and in that illuminating glow, he somehow looked noticeably older, or perhaps he just looked entirely more real than he had in years. He proceeded to finish off his tea in one single long sip, before standing up and placing the empty mug incredibly gently down into the sink. There was absolutely no loud clatter, and there was no sense of rushing. When he finally turned and walked away, he didn't utter a formal goodbye. He merely offered a quick, fleeting glance over his shoulder, a look that heavily suggested he might eventually return. Or perhaps he might not. I purposefully chose not to follow him out of the room. Instead, I meticulously rinsed my own empty mug out, and slowly walked it directly over to the bright windowsill. Looking outside, the suburban street was completely empty, and the surrounding air still visibly carried the distinct crispness of the morning cool. I deliberately left the mug resting right there on the wooden windowsill, standing back and quietly letting the residual steam rise effortlessly into the expansive quiet of the room. The mug persistently stayed on that exact spot on the windowsill for the entire afternoon, continuously catching and reflecting the ever-changing light as the sun slowly moved across the sky. No one ever came back to retrieve it, and no one bothered to move it. I realized then that sometimes the things that are left behind don't actually represent a tragic mistake or a permanent goodbye. Rather, they simply signify a quiet, sacred place where something incredibly hard finally softened. The visible steam had long since vanished into the ether, but the profound, resonant warmth seemed to permanently linger in the surrounding air.